Introduction.
At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher.
Abraham Lincoln. That morning. With crystalline awareness, the moments of that morning will forever be ingrained in my memory. The phone rang with what seemed an unusual intensity. It was a friend who urgently told me to turn on the television. The first image on the screen was the unmistakable silhouette of the New York skyline and the World Trade Center buildings. However, there was something more, something different, the ominous ribbon of blackish smoke billowing out of the North Tower. The announcer was stunned and at a loss for words when out of the right side of the screen emerged a small and fast-moving shape that disappeared behind the Twin Towers. And then The explosion. The yellow and red burst of horror-filled energy ballooned out of the South Tower. At that instant, a cold pulse went through my body. From the subjective stem of my soul, I felt the collective terror of the thousands of souls who were in the building. From the objective cortex of my intellect, I knew the Illuminati were initiating the first move of their deadly endgame. For innumerable hours of that day, more and more news came in. Other planes had been hijacked. The Pentagon was hit. The South Tower tilted and came down in a pyrotechnical display that seemed right out of Hollywood. The announcers did not know where the president was. The North Tower collapsed in an equally dramatic and terrifying fashion. The gigantic ball of gray dust billowed and chased thousands of onlookers down the streets. It was reported that up to 50,000 people could be dead. Another airliner was downed over Pennsylvania. It was reported that the vice president was in a secured underground bunker. All commercial jetliners were ordered to land. World Trade Center buildings 3, 4, 5, and 6 were on fire. The new estimate was that 20,000 could have been caught in the towers. It was rumored that Osama bin Laden was behind this attack. It was still unclear where the president was. The area was sealed off, and Mayor Giuliani was giving statements. We watched dozens and dozens of replays. There were more reports that bin Laden was behind the attack. The president was reported to be on his way back to Washington. Revised estimates were again lowered to 10,000 that could have lost their lives. World Trade Center building number 7, a 47-story tower, mysteriously came down that evening, and on and on. The trick. Just as those of us old enough to remember, almost 40 years ago, where they were and how they felt when Kennedy was assassinated, we will all remember 9/11/01. These events and images have been intentionally ingrained into our consciousness. This is very important to remember. The reason this is so vital is we need to fully realize the masters of deception who are behind this massive drama are stage masters and magicians of the very highest order. Always remember, the magician twirls his cane seductively and gets us to look off into the sky. Yes, those jets did slam into the WTC and Pentagon, and almost 3,000 people died. To be sure, this was one of the most unjust, deadliest, and cold-hearted attacks on civilians in history. The personal terror and destruction generated were no illusions. At the same time, if we are to free ourselves of this matrix of fear, we must break out of the mental boxes that have been subliminally masterminded into our thought programs. The trick that has been played on us so successfully by the power elite is to create a massive cultural subconscious of primal fear. Fear takes us out of our heart space and destroys our intellectual process. Those who do not use their God-given power of objective intellectual reasoning are controlled by the vagrancies of an undisciplined mind and are easily duped. Those who do not stay centered in their heart space are easily moved toward the self-destructive energies of anger, hate, revenge, confusion, and fear. Hegelian principle. When viewed objectively from a historical perspective, one can see that the events of 9/11 were the classic setup using the Hegelian principle. George Wilhelm Hegel, 1770 to 1831, was a German philosopher who is today considered one of the most influential thinkers in modern times. Hegel's articulation and teaching concerning successive phases in the consciousness and awareness of man is still part of the bedrock of philosophical teaching. Hegel is known for his theorem, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. A simplified English translation is problem, reaction, and solution. For hundreds of years, the Illuminati have used the Hegelian process to further their cause. They secretly create a problem, the general population acts with fear, and the solution is to transfer power to those who originally created the problem. It is effective and diabolical. An example of this process is Roosevelt's agents had cracked the Japanese secret codes and knew that Pearl Harbor would be attacked months in advance. However, FDR intentionally never gave this information to the naval base commander because he wanted a cause to enter the war. Previous to the attack, the people of America were overwhelmingly opposed to getting involved in either the European or Asian conflicts. After the so-called surprise assault, Congress reacted and declared war in the next few days, while the vast majority of citizens who understandably believe this story patriotically came together to fight. For those people who believe in fairness and goodness, even considering that rogue elements in our government could carry out such wicked actions, this is difficult to comprehend. It is essential that good and honest people consider the accusations and, more importantly, the evidence. This evidence documents how federal agents have initiated violent and increasingly deadly action against innocent American citizens, i.e., Ruby Ridge, Waco, the World Trade Center bombing of 1993, Oklahoma City, TWA Flight 800, and now 9/11. If this evidence is correct, that unconstitutional and lethal force is being used against our own citizens, together with the accusation that the predominant media is intentionally presenting untruthful information, then, well, you be the judge. This booklet is not for everyone, but it is for those who love their country and have that rare quality called an open mind. Today in America, about 1% of the population can connect the dots. They realize that a handful of self-professed elite have virtual control of our banking system, of our movies, of the news outlets, and of both political parties. Until and unless we increase the relative numbers of citizens who understand this reality to at least 5% of the population, a critical mass, our culture will continue its march toward a one-world fascist government. This is definitely not fun to write or think about. However, it is a present truth, and as the Bible has said,
"Let those who have ears listen."
This booklet is presenting evidence that goes against everything that the mainstream media and political structure would have people believe. For many people, including myself, this is a very difficult pill to swallow. However, only by facing our fears will we be able to understand the truth and to live in real freedom and love. As Jesus said,
"The truth shall set you free."
Hopefully, when people become aware of the massive and draconian fraud that has been perpetrated on our nation, enough people will awaken from their dreamlike slumbers to take appropriate action to restore the ideals of our republic. Perhaps these thoughts and ideas can be part of that process. The setup.
I tell you, freedom and human rights in America are doomed. The U.S. government will lead the American people and the West in general into an unbearable hell and a choking life.
Osama bin Laden, BBC taped video interview after September the 11th. The American people have been played like a fine violin in the hands of a master in relation to the information we have been given by the predominant media. As soon as the 9/11 events began unfolding, the so-called experts immediately showed up on TV, and lo and behold, a very high percentage of these talking heads just happen to belong to the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR is the primary political organization of the elite in the United States, and is described by former Senator and presidential candidate Barry Goldwater as
an offshoot of a British secret society whose purpose is to destroy the sovereignty of the United States and create a one-world government.
The following 14 points are objective pieces of factual information and relevant questions concerning events which took place before 9/11 that have been glossed over, misrepresented, or ignored by the government and media. Point number 1. In 1979, the CIA initiated a massive program of covert military aid to indigenous Islamic tribes in Afghanistan and Islamic volunteers from other nations who were in opposition to the Russian military invasion of that country. The Russians had formed a coalition with several Afghani tribes from the north of that country, which are referred to as the Northern Alliance. The tribes supported by the CIA were called the Mujahideen by the Western press. Ronald Reagan in 1986 euphemistically referred to the Mujahideen as the freedom fighters of Central Asia. Elements within the Mujahideen later branched off to become Al-Qaeda, again with full CIA support and funding. Point 2. The leader of Al-Qaeda is a Saudi Arabian who had been educated in Europe, whose name is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden's father was Sheikh Mohammed bin Laden, who founded and built Bin Laden Brothers Construction Company. Later, this company was renamed the Saudi Bin Laden Group. It should also be noted that from the early 1980s, Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset whose Western cover name was Tim Osman. Point 3. The bin Laden family is one of the wealthiest in Saudi Arabia and has been instrumental in building dozens of American military bases in the Middle East. The bin Laden family is closely connected with the ruling sheiks of Saudi Arabia and has strong political and personal connections around the world. Point 4. The bin Laden family and the Bush families have been friends and business partners for many years. In 1977, George Bush Jr. started Arbusto Energy Company in Midland, Texas. One of his first and major investors was Salim bin Laden, who at that time had become the president of the Saudi bin Laden Group. Salim happened to be the older brother of Osama bin Laden. Another interesting connection is Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz. Mahfouz is one of the richest men in the world and was also a major investor in Arbusto Energy Company. Further, he was operational director of the corrupt BCCI between 1986 and 1990. According to CIA Director James Woolsey in testimony to the U.S. Senate in 1998, Mahfouz was a major contributor to Osama and Al-Qaeda. Oh, one more little detail. Mahfouz's sister is Osama bin Laden's wife. It's like one big happy family. Point 5. Al-Qaeda was involved in the bombing of the United States embassies, which killed 35 Americans and 150 locals in 1992. Al-Qaeda was also partially responsible for the suicide bombing of the USS Cole, which killed 25 American sailors in 1996. Point 6. Both Yemen and Sudan offered to extradite Osama bin Laden after the bombings of the embassies and the USS Cole. However, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who was appointed by Bill Clinton, refused to take bin Laden. Point 7. John O'Neill was a deputy director of the FBI and resigned his post in disgust because of interference from both the Clinton and Bush administrations in the investigation of Al-Qaeda. He allegedly said this:
"The main obstacles to investigate Islamic terrorism were U.S. oil corporate interest."
Mr. O'Neill had the misfortune to be hired as the director of security at the World Trade Center starting on 9/11/01. He was killed on that day in the World Trade Center bombing. Point 8. European newspapers have widely reported that Osama bin Laden was sick with a kidney malfunction and went to an American hospital in Dubai in January of 2001. While there, he met with the CIA's section chief. These accusations are extremely serious because this is after the bombings of both the American embassies and the USS Cole that were tied to bin Laden. Point 9. Intelligent people from around the world laugh at the mere idea that bin Laden could orchestrate the complex hijackings of 4 commercial airliners that took off from 3 different airports from a cave in the mountains of Afghanistan, 12,000 miles away. Point 10. In October of 1993, there was a car bombing of the World Trade Center. The bombing was not successful in bringing the building down because the car was parked too far away from the interior columns. Unfortunately, 34 people were killed. The bomber was a 43-year-old Egyptian, Imad Salim. According to stories from the New York Times, Salim was paid $1 million and was trained by the FBI to perform this reprehensible act. Salim figured out that he was being set up to be the patsy and taped John Antisev. Antisev, a top American FBI agent, told Salim to proceed with the bombing. The media is strangely quiet about this act of treason from within. This is incredible. Few people are aware that there was an attempt to blow up the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City in 1985, 10 years before the last incident. The New American Magazine has done a wonderful job of investigating and reporting about this group that initially tried to blow up the building and who live in Elohim City, Oklahoma. Many independent investigators believe this same rogue group was involved in the 1995 bombing and may have had support from elements within the FBI. It is said that
a thief always returns to the scene of the crime.
Could it be that units within the government have come back to finish their unfinished work at the World Trade Center, as it appears they did in Oklahoma City? Point 11. The United States government spends a minimum of $40 billion of our tax money a year on the FBI, CIA, and NSA. These agencies were responsible for helping start and finance Al-Qaeda and have been closely monitoring the Taliban, bin Laden, and Al-Qaeda for the past decade. Yet all of these agencies, with all their money and all their technology, flatly deny they had prior knowledge that there would be such an attack. Hogwash. After the assault, these agencies were actually rewarded with significant increases in funding and were lauded by the administration and the press. This is sick stuff. Point 12. In the week before 9/11, there was an increase of 1,200% in trading activity of orders to go short on the stocks of American Airlines and United Airlines, as reported by the Chicago Securities Exchange. An investor goes short when he expects the stock to decrease in value. Tens of millions of dollars were made by those who appear to have had forewarning of this event. According to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the London Independent, a high percentage of this activity came from one investment firm, Deutsche Bank and A.B. Brown. The principal manager of this firm until 1998 is now the director of the CIA. There has still been no official investigation. Point 13. According to Reuters News Service, 2 of the terrorists went to a topless bar a few nights before the attack. While at the bar, they were supposedly obnoxious, had lots of drinks, and each spent over $200 for lap dances. The story goes on to say they talked about how America was going to suffer and conveniently left business cards. Oh, one more thing. Being faithful Muslims, they also left a Holy Koran. Sure. The spin doctors must have been drunk when they came up with this story. They want us to believe fundamental Muslims who were going to give their lives for Allah would go to a strip bar, get drunk, which is against Islamic law, tell the world what they're going to do, and then leave their business cards and a Quran. The only thing more amazing than this story is that most Americans seem to believe it. Point 14. On the day of the attack, a couple in Jersey City, New Jersey, reported that they saw a group of men on top of an adjoining building filming the first jet hit the North Tower and cheering. They assumed that these men were Arab terrorists and called the police. The police caught these men, but they were not Arabs. They were Israelis, here in the United States without legal permits. They worked for a moving company that, according to Forward Magazine, a local Jewish publication, has possible ties with the Mossad. Who were these men who had prior knowledge? Why was this story suppressed? And why did our government allow them to return to Israel? The hijackings. Naturally, the common people don't want war. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's top men during the Nuremberg trials. The administration and media's story concerning the actual hijackings is this. On the morning of 9/11/01, 19 radical Islamic fundamentalists hijacked 4 commercial airliners. The hijackers used paper cutters to overwhelm and kill the 8 pilots and to control the 266 passengers and flight attendants. The 2 flights that took off from Boston, Flights 11 and 175, were redirected to New York, where they were crashed into the World Trade Center buildings. The World Trade Center buildings caught on fire, causing the trusses to soften and expand, and both WTC Buildings 1 and 2 came down. The flight that took off from Newark, Flight 93, flew all the way out to Ohio and then circled back towards Washington, D.C. During this flight, several passengers made phone calls from the plane. A number of the passengers made an unsuccessful attempt to regain control of the plane, and during the struggle, the plane crashed in central Pennsylvania. The now famous last words of Todd Beamer, one of the passengers of Flight 93, were, "Let's roll." The 4th flight, Flight 77, took off from Washington, D.C., flew across Virginia, West Virginia, and got to Ohio, turned around, and flew back to Washington, D.C., where it slammed into the Pentagon. This is the story that a vast majority of Americans have repeatedly been told and believe. The following list of objective facts, worthy questions, and valuable insights into this segment of the 9/11 events are essential to making good decisions as to what really happened. Point 15. Of the 8 pilots on the 4 flights, 6 had military experience and were considered men who could take care of themselves. Is it possible all 8 could be overwhelmed and killed by hijackers who were using paper cutters? Further, is it possible none of the 8 pilots could take any evasive actions or send out alerts to the FAA? Yes, these things are possible, but they are not probable. Point 16. 2 supposed pilots of hijacked Flight 77 were Khalid al-Midar and Nawak al-Hamzi. This is the flight that disappeared over Ohio, came back, and pulled off an extreme spiral maneuver, leveled off, and hit the Pentagon. Flight instructor Rick Garza at Sorby's Flying Club had this to say about our ace pilots.
It was like Dumb and Dumber. I mean, they were clueless. It was clear to me they weren't going to make it as pilots.
Point 17. Flying jumbo commercial airliners is not like driving a golf cart. There are significant skills one has to learn. First, the pilots who were not from this country would have to fly by sight for several hundred miles. Secondly, the pilots on Flights 175 and 77 were said to have brought the planes down from 30,000 feet, performed fast and tight 280-degree veers, and hit their targets with bullseye precision, all by hand. Give me a break. A commercial airliner creates 1.5 to 2 times the normal gravity when it turns. With turns at this altitude, this speed, and this degree of tightness, the plane would be pulling 6 to 7 times normal gravity. According to experienced commercial pilots, these maneuvers would be virtually impossible for any but the most advanced pilots to accomplish. Point 18. Very few people are aware that the Telegraph, a paper out of New Hampshire, reported that flights 175 and 11 crossed paths at the same moment, directly above the Stewart International Airport in New Windsor, New York. Well, what a coincidence! One of the controllers of this facility is reported to be also the controller of the Egypt Air Flight 990 that crashed in 1999, when the pilot supposedly committed suicide. Interesting. Point 19. It must also be noted the FAA has not released flight path information or the full voice recordings of the communications between the planes and the FAA. There are 2 black boxes on each large airliner, and these boxes are built to withstand major crashes. Thus, it is a bit strange that the FAA says that most of the information on all 8 black boxes of these flights was destroyed. Point 20. Few Americans are aware of a technology called Global Hawk. With this technology, flying drones, which look very similar to commercial planes, can be maneuvered with great precision. Many believe that this technology can also be used to override the manual or auto control of a commercial airliner, and perhaps could have been used on 911. 21. The official story is United Flight 93 took off from New Jersey, was hijacked, and flew out to Ohio, where it turned around and headed back towards Washington, D.C. Supposedly, the passengers made several calls to loved ones, and Scott Beamer and others made an attempt to take back control of the plane. During the fight, the plane crashed. The problem with this story is that the plane did not crash because of the fight. The plane was shot down. Here are the facts. 1. The debris was scattered over an 8-mile radius. 2. The debris was blown into tiny pieces. 3. Witnesses in the area report hearing a loud explosion while the plane was in the air and seeing military jets. Point 22. Several years ago, professional golfer Payne Stewart was flying with friends out of Florida in a small private jet towards Dallas. Within a short period of time after takeoff, there was a malfunction in the plane, and the pilot and passengers passed out and lost contact with the FAA. Within 18 minutes, NORAD had scrambled an F-16 to fly next to this plane. Within 22 minutes, there were 4 F-16s flying in tandem with this disabled plane. This is all standard operating procedure, SOP. NORAD's Central Command headquarters are in Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado. They have the highest quality tracking technology in the world, and it is their responsibility to monitor the skies over America and to protect America from missiles and planes. That is their job. In contrast, no F-16s or other planes were scrambled in time for flights 11 or 175 that took off from Boston, even though there was 36 minutes between the time the FAA knew there was a hijacking and the time Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower. The case of Flight 77 is even more alarming, as it was in the air for over 43 minutes with full knowledge that it was aimed at the White House, the Capitol, or the Pentagon. Andrews Air Force Base is only minutes away, and not one plane was sent up, and no planes were scrambled from the Langley Air Force Base until after the attack. There are several military bases in the area with the capability and responsibility to protect our capital, yet nothing was done. It appears that the order was given by NORAD to stand down. The destruction of the World Trade Center complex.
None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free.
German philosopher Goethe. The whole world saw it. Those jets flew into the skyscrapers. There were enormous explosions, and the fires brought the buildings down. We all saw it with our own eyes. Everybody knows it. I have heard this or similar refrains from numerous people as they look at you with this incredulous gaze that someone would even doubt that it happened as explained on the tube. However, there is more to this story than meets the eye, especially the eye that has been exposed to the filter of corporate television. Point 23. Construction on the World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2, that's north and south, was commenced on September the 11th, 1971. At 1,350 feet, they were two of the tallest and most famous buildings on Earth. One fact most people did not know is that they were engineered and built like the proverbial brick outhouses. These buildings were over-engineered to withstand major storms and hits from large airliners. They were built with 47 enormous interior steel core columns, together with 236 large exterior steel columns that were welded and bolted together with steel plates. Further, there were steel trusses which crisscrossed, making a mesh that connected every other exterior column. Plus, there was diagonal bracing and steel rods connecting the trusses. There were also corrugated pans with poured concrete on every floor, and all of this was anchored in a very deep and heavy foundation. Point 24. The buildings were architecturally designed to absorb energy and to sway in storms. According to witnesses who were in the building relatively near to where the planes made contact, the towers briefly swayed for seconds as intended. Other witnesses in the area said that the noise and blasts were significant, but the tremor felt at the time of contact was minimal. Point 25. Fact: no steel-structured building in New York, the United States, or in the world has ever come down due to fire. In the last 100 years, literally dozens of steel buildings have caught on fire and burned for long periods of time and have not come down. A good example is the Meridian Plaza in Philadelphia, a 38-story office building that in 1991 had a hot fire. It burned on 8 floors for 19 hours, and 3 firefighters died combating the blaze, but it did not come close to bringing down the building. In contrast, the World Trade Center North Tower fire lasted 1 hour and 43 minutes, and the World Trade Center South Tower fire lasted 56 minutes. The fires in both towers burned significant proportions of rubble, sheetrock, carpet, furniture, etc., producing lots of black smoke, indicating they were burning inefficiently and were relatively cool fires. Point 26. The facts. A. Steel melts at 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. B. Jet fuel, when mixed in precise proportions with air, will burn briefly at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. C. Because of the debris, carpeting, sheetrock, furniture, concrete, aluminum, etc., and lack of oxygen, the fire at the World Trade Center probably burned at 1,200 to 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Point 27. It must also be remembered that a significant portion of the fuel exploded outside of the buildings. The exterior columns were exposed to the air on 3 sides and would dissipate heat at a fast rate, and the beams and columns were coated with fireproofing materials. Point 28. The official story is the buildings came down at point of contact because the intensity of the fires caused the trusses to push out the columns. Yet, when one views the hole created in the North Tower by the plane, there are only relatively small fires, and the heat must not be excessive because you can see 2 people standing and staring out near the opening. Point 29. The top section of the South Tower began to tilt at approximately 9:59 a.m. At this moment, a large cloud of gray dust suddenly puffed out of the building. The 35 stories of the top section continued to tip to 23 degrees past vertical, At this point, the upper segment was hanging over the edge by approximately 65 feet. In frame-by-frame pictures, one can see the concentric and uniform mushrooming gray cloud rapidly expand to envelop the building. As this was happening, one can see debris being blown away from the building with an extremely powerful blast. The overhanging upper section of the building was then mysteriously shrouded and was never seen again. Then the whole building came straight down. Within an incredibly fast 10.4 seconds, the once mighty 1,350-foot tower was reduced to a pile of totally pulverized remains. Government's story is that this building experienced a compression or pancake demolition caused from weakened trusses and weight from above. At first, this explanation sounds plausible, especially because this is what the television reports have told us time and time again. However, common sense would indicate that the center of gravity of the top section was not centered over the lower section. Thus, if there was a compression demolition of the building, it would not be uniform because the center of gravity was considerably off-center. Secondly, the severed top section that was tilting very much over the edge would fall somewhat independently. Third, this section would fall at a faster rate than the anchored lower section because it would not meet the resistance of the intact lower section. Fourth, the top and lower sections would break into pieces. They would not pulverize. None of these four things happened. Point 30. The complete demolition of the North Tower at 10:29 a.m. took only 8.1 seconds. The North Tower came neatly down upon itself, and its remains were equally powdered. Point 31. Facts are very stubborn things. According to the law of falling bodies, as originally put forward by Galileo and still accepted today by all scientists, as described in the World Book Encyclopedia under Falling Bodies, Law of, the total distance traveled at the end of any specific time in a total vacuum is calculated by this formula. Distance being d equals 32.16 divided by 2 times time in seconds squared. If there is any resistance, then the speed and time of the falling body slows down in relation to this resistance. In the case of the World Trade Center towers north and south, we know that the towers were 1,350 feet tall. Thus, you would have this equation for the fastest time of total drop in a vacuum. 1,350 equals 32.16 divided by 2 times time in seconds squared. This works out to 9.1627 seconds as the fastest time these buildings could come down. This presents some very interesting questions because the World Trade Center South Tower came down in 10.4 seconds, and the World Trade Center North Tower came down in 8.1 seconds. Additionally, there was resistance, and plenty of it. The resistance was the massive lower sections of the buildings that were stabilized by over 250 major interior and exterior steel columns and thousands of steel trusses. This defies the laws of gravity. Thus, either the height of the buildings is inaccurate, the time of the falls is inaccurate, the scientific calculation that has been used for hundreds of years is inaccurate, or something pulled down these buildings at a faster rate. Check it out for yourself. Point 32. Remember the gray cloud that concentrically blasted out and down the imploding buildings and chased thousands of New Yorkers down the streets while covering the whole area with a sand-like substance? What was that stuff? It was cement and other materials that had been crystallized. Could the blast of jet fuel create this crystallization? No, because at full blast, jet fuel only expands at 208 feet per second. Could a compression demolition do this? No. There is not enough latent energy. The cement would crack and break, but would not pulverize. The only way the molecular composition of these materials could be so scrambled is if there were small-scale nuclear devices or there were high-tech explosives. Since there are no unusual readings of radioactivity that can be confirmed, modern explosives are the logical choice. High-tech explosives, such as RTX or C4, can expand at over 1,000 feet per second and create extremely hot temperatures. Modern explosives could cause the crystallization of the building materials while creating a vacuum that could pull down the buildings at a faster rate than normal speed and leave a residue of extremely high temperatures. Point 33. FEMA put forward this hurried and very short explanation concerning the collapse of the World Trade Center's north and south buildings.
Expansion of floor slabs and framing results in outward deflection of columns and potential overload.
From this expert opinion, the administration and media have aggressively promoted the pancake theory, which claims that the floor trusses expanded, which caused the columns to buckle, the joints to break, and the floors then compressed upon themselves. However, an objective observer would consider these important points. A. Never before has any steel frame building come down because of fire. The World Trade Center fires only burned for relatively short periods of time and at low heat levels. B. For the World Trade Center buildings to react in this way, literally thousands of super heavy-duty joints and welds would have to snap at precisely the same instant. Remember, these particular buildings were engineered for expansion and flexibility. There was also fire retardant sprayed on all of the steel, and the burning patterns were inconsistent throughout the floors. C. A pancake collapse could not come down with such speed. D. A pancake collapse would not have the latent energy to crystallize the building materials, to shred aluminum, or blast rubble to such distances. E. A pancake collapse would not create or maintain the astronomical heat patterns which were recorded and were monitored for weeks afterwards. Point 34. On September the 16th, 5 days after the attack, NASA flew a plane over the site to take measurements and to create a thermal surface map. In this period of time, hundreds of truckloads of debris had already been carried off, and firemen had sprayed millions of gallons of water on the smoking rubble. The results show that there were several hot spots with temperatures over 1,000 Fahrenheit on the surface, with one spot at the South Tower that recorded 1,377 degrees. Most of us noticed that the area continued to smoke for weeks. Since neither tons of jet fuel nor a compression demolition have the potential to create this type of heat, much less maintaining this heat for days afterwards, an impartial detective would have to conclude that there was another source for these extreme temperatures. Christopher Bolin of the American Free Press has also discovered that the steel columns at the base of the foundations, 70 feet underground, were melted. That would indicate that temperatures would have had to exceed 2,700 degrees. Hello! Is anybody in the predominant media, government, or law enforcement listening? Point 35. World Trade Center Building 6 is an important part of the puzzle. Shortly after World Trade Center Building 2 was hit, there was a huge explosion that appears to emanate from the center section of World Trade Center Building 6. Only later did the building catch on fire. It then burned for hours at a very hot temperature, and the fire was eventually put out. Again, an objective investigator would ask, A, what caused the building to explode before it caught on fire? B, after the center of the building had been blown apart and it had experienced a prolonged and intense fire, why did this building not come down like buildings 1, 2, and 7? Point 36. The facts surrounding World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story building, are even more bizarre. World Trade Center Building 7 was built on top of a major electrical substation that housed 10 large transformers. Further, the landlord had allowed the tenants to install large diesel fuel tanks with a capacity of over 42,000 gallons to take care of emergency power generation in the building. Some of the major tenants in the building were Mayor Giuliani, who had built a $13 million control bunker in this building, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the Secret Service. It seems quite strange that the mayor would build such an expensive bunker in a building that was on top of such potentially explosive tanks and transformers. Additionally, World Trade Center Building 7 was not reported to be on fire until 3 p.m. This is 5 hours after World Trade Center 1 and 2 had collapsed. These fires were relatively minor and had been burning for less than 3 hours when the whole thing came tumbling down at 5:25 p.m. It appears from pictures to be a totally conventional demolition. There were no huge explosions. The building walls fell neatly in on themselves, and the rubble was cracked and broken, not pulverized. It is of interest that neither FEMA nor anyone else made a report or even made a suggestion as to what had happened to this huge building that housed some very interesting tenants. Point 37. It is said that
every picture tells a story.
And in the case of the seismic activity as documented by Columbia University Seismology Group, there are some very interesting stories. The South Tower registered a tremor of 2.1 and came down in approximately 10.4 seconds. The North Tower registered a tremor of 2.3 and came down in just slightly over 8 seconds. The pattern that is registered for World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2 indicates a series of bombs were detonated in cadence, with the last explosion being the largest charge. The pattern as registered by the fall of World Trade Center Building 7 is significantly smaller in magnitude and is the signature of a conventional demolition. The attack on the Pentagon.
They that give up essential liberty to obtain temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Benjamin Franklin. The Pentagon is one of the largest office buildings in the world and houses the Department of Defense. It sits on the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia, directly across from Washington, D.C. The building is a traditional 5-sided pentagon and has 5 concentric rings that are connected by passageways. Construction on the Pentagon was started in September of 1941, and it was finished in 1942. Now more than 25,000 civilians and military personnel work there. Many historians believe that symbols are essential to the methodology of the Illuminati. Thus, it is interesting to note many believe that Washington, D.C. was built upon a street grid that represents Masonic occult symbols when seen from above. It is also interesting that Webster's Dictionary explains a pentangle as a magical occult emblem. Regardless of why the Department of Defense building was designed in such a way, we all know the Pentagon is supposedly the most protected building of the American Armed Forces. So, when we are told a known hijacked plane that is 3 states to the west makes a 180-degree turn back toward the Capitol and is allowed to attack the military command center of the whole United States, totally unmolested, something just isn't right. Point 38. There are more cameras and surveillance equipment around the Washington, D.C. area than any other place in the world. So when the military releases only 2 pictures of the attack that don't even show the attacking plane, then I would hope good people would start asking some very tough questions. Point 39. Supposedly, within 15 minutes after the crash into the Pentagon, FBI agents were driving to local businesses and confiscating their surveillance cameras. Point 40. According to the military, there were only 2 pieces of debris supposedly from the plane: a very small and nondescript piece of machined metal and a piece of aluminum that is painted. The painting on the aluminum does not appear to match the emblems of an American Airlines jet, and the aluminum appears to be thinner than the skin of a commercial jet. The obvious question is, where are the engines, the landing gear, and other pieces of evidence that would have survived? A 757 jet, even after crashing and burning, would leave multiple pieces of recognizable wreckage. Where is the evidence? Point 41. There are multiple and contrasting eyewitness accounts of what people saw, which is understandable. According to the Washington Post,
Steve Patterson, who lives in Pentagon City, said it appeared to him that a commuter jet swooped over Arlington National Cemetery and headed for the Pentagon. The plane, which appeared to hold about 8 to 12 people.
If this eyewitness account is anywhere close to accurate, an objective investigator must consider whether this aircraft was a commercial jet or it was a drone. It must be remembered, Flight 77 totally disappeared from the radar screen while it was headed west over Ohio. No one claims to have seen the plane on its eastwardly return flight toward Washington. NORAD does not appear to have scrambled any jets to investigate this flight until after it hit the Pentagon. The aircraft accomplished a hard, low, and fast 270-degree banking turn and hit the Pentagon with deadly accurate precision. And supposedly, this aircraft was a massive 757 commercial airliner. I don't think so. The cover-up, subsequent events, revelations, and the non-investigation of 9/11.
We are now at a pivotal point. Our situation is comparable to that of Nazi Germany in 1939, when the German people allowed Adolf Hitler to persuade them that it was in their best interest to begin attacking other nations. This is the simple truth beneath all the propaganda, justifications, rationalizations, and excuses. As always, we must choose whether we are going to be governed by fear or by love. And the moral of the story is that those who fail to learn the lessons which history teaches are doomed to repeat them.
Allison Hartsong, Mount Shasta, California, in a letter to the Sacramento Bee on October 12, 2002. In the days, weeks, and months since 9/11, our nation has changed. We have been saturated by 24/7 fear-based, biased, inaccurate, racist, and hateful broadcasting. Literally, there are a couple of announcers on MSNBC who appear to be close to frothing at the mouth as they spew their contorted messages. In this period of time, there have not been one or two manipulated Hegelian events. There have been dozens. Following are just a few of the happenings and incidents that deserve attention. Point 42. In the weeks after 9/11, anonymous letters and packages were sent to several unsuspecting people filled with the deadly anthrax powder. Senator Tom Daschle's office was the most publicized location to receive this deadly surprise. 6 people from around the country were killed by this insane scheme. Of course, the corporate media at first blamed Al-Qaeda, and then the experts from the Council on Foreign Relations scratched their chins and shifted the focus to Saddam Hussein. The word was now out.
We have to stop Iraq.
Later on, when scientific analysis was made showing that this particular strain was a technologically superior anthrax that was 10 times finer in micron size than the finest known grade of Soviet anthrax, with an additive that was only made at an American weapons laboratory, the talking heads suddenly dropped the issue like a hot potato. The sales of Cipro, an expensive designer antibiotic, went through the roof, making the parent company hundreds of millions of dollars. Later, it was learned that President Bush and his inner circle had all been put on Cipro a month before 9/11. As a sad postscript, 18 prominent biologists and virologists from around the world who may have had knowledge about the origins of this type of anthrax have all mysteriously died between September the 15th, 2001 and November the 20th, 2002. Point 43. On November 12, 2001, American airliner Flight 587, a 300 Airbus, took off from Kennedy International Airport on its way to the Dominican Republic. Minutes after takeoff, the plane lost its rear wings, dropped its engines, and crashed into Rockaway, New York. The official explanation given was the plane hit the backwash of the plane ahead of it, which created so much turbulence the plane broke apart. The results from this accident were 260 innocent people killed, and the American public was further traumatized. The problem with this story is that even according to the FAA, Flight 587 was more than 3 minutes behind the preceding flight. This distance and time buffer is well within the safety guidelines of the FAA. Now think about it. Every day for the last 40 years, thousands of airliners have flown at these or closer distances to each other, and never before has such an accident happened. Planes don't just break apart in the middle of the air. It is also interesting that no full investigation of this horrible accident was made. What is going on here? Point 44. There was no move to initiate an official congressional investigation of the most significant terrorist attack in the history of our nation until November of 2002. 14 months after the attack. Then, Bush had the audacity to name Henry Kissinger, who will be seen as one of the most tarnished and corrupt characters in the history of our nation, as heading this investigation. Weeks later, Kissinger resigned because he would not disclose his client list. The Illuminati are so overconfident that they are intentionally rubbing the noses of American citizens with this arrogant insult called an investigation. This is a total outrage. Sadly, a vast majority of both Democratic and Republican congressmen and senators have not even called for an honest inquiry, did not care, or were bullied into going along, and have openly supported this cover-up. Perhaps this is one of the most pertinent indications of how far and how fast the integrity of our representative government system has fallen. Fortunately, there were a few exceptions to this rule. Congressman Ron Paul of Texas spoke articulately and courageously for the truth. Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney from Georgia also asked for an investigation, and for her efforts was instantly branded by the media and some within her own party as almost a traitor. Her opponents collected more than $1 million, much of it came from out of state, to defeat her in her bid for re-election. Another voice of reason was Senator Paul Wellstone, who went against the politically correct posturing and asked that there be an official examination of 911. On October the 25th, 2002, weeks before his tightly contested election, Senator Wellstone's private Beech King aircraft went down in northern Minnesota, killing the senator, his family, campaign workers, and the pilots. No cause of accident has been released. In the following weeks, the Republican candidate who fully supported the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security Bill, and the invasion of Iraq was elected and shifted the balance of power in the Senate to the Republicans. To these voices of reason and a handful of other elected representatives who had the guts to speak the truth, we need to say a prayer of thanks. Point 45. The first procedure at the scene of a crime is to protect and investigate the evidence. However, remember what happened at Oklahoma City. According to General Ben Parton and other investigators of the Alfred Murrah building, the evidence had been blown up, hauled away, and buried before detectives could make an investigation. The company that did all of this was the Controlled Demolition Company. It just so happens the Controlled Demolition Company was hired within a short period of time to clear away and sell the rubble of the World Trade Center at a very profitable rate. The Controlled Demolition Company did their job well and also kept everyone away from examining or even photographing the evidence. The largest and most prestigious fireman's magazine in the country is the Firefighters Magazine. Its editor, Bill Manning, was very critical about the lack of investigation and the removal of evidence. He said it was a half-baked farce. Point 46. The FBI, CIA, NSA, and administration all deny they had prior knowledge that such an attack would occur. Yet, the evidence that has surfaced since 9/11 shows: A. Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak said in a December 2001 interview,
"We expected something was going to happen and informed the Americans. We told them."
B. Mayor Willie Brown of San Francisco, author Salman Rushdie, and Attorney General John Ashcroft have all made public statements that they were warned not to fly on commercial planes at this time. C. German police and Israeli intelligence both warned of the coming attacks against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. D. FBI agent Robert Wright held a press conference in May of 2002. He said he had been threatened with national security violations if he shared with the public the FBI's previous information. E. The managers of the flight school in Minnesota, where suspected hijacker Zacarias Moussaoui was taking flight lessons, called the FBI several times to warn them. Regional FBI agents wanted to do a full investigation, but were stopped by Central Headquarters. F. A $7 billion legal suit has been brought against Bush and other governmental administrators by 400 families who lost relatives on 9/11. The suit is claiming that Bush and others allowed this terrorist act to occur. Their attorney, Stanley Hilton, is pointing out that Mohammed Atta and 2 other hijackers were given training at the Pensacola Naval Flight Station. G. It is reported that employees of Odigo, an instant messaging company, did not show up for work on 9/11 at the World Trade Center. Odigo's headquarters, which are in Tel Aviv, Israel, just happened to be next to the Department of Counterterrorism. And on and on. Point 47. At first, we were told that there would be up to 50,000 casualties, and thank God that number ended up being much lower. Here is some factual information we should consider. A. MSNBC reported that many of the schools and businesses around the World Trade Center were half empty that day. The World Trade Center North Tower was hit in an area where there were the fewest number of occupied offices. B. Flights 11, 176, 93, and 77 had combined seating for more than 1,328 passengers, while on that day, there were 266 passengers, which is a 20.03% occupancy. Normal occupancy for transcontinental flights averages over 75%. American and United Airlines have been very tight-lipped about giving out information. C. Flight 77, or the drone, zeroed in on an area of the Pentagon that was being renovated, which was known to have the fewest number of people. This was also the exact opposite side from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's office. The American public has been told that these hijackers were emotionally unstable members of the Islamic Jihad and were out to attack the Great Satan. If this is true, would they not try to do the maximum damage? Or is this information just unusual coincidence? Point 48. It has been learned that on August the 15th, 2001, many of the leaders of the Taliban were in Houston negotiating with the Unocal Corporation for rights to build a gas pipeline from the oil and gas fields east of the Caspian Sea through Afghanistan and out to the Arabian Ocean. Unocal is closely connected with the Halliburton Corporation, which was formerly managed by Vice President Dick Cheney. These oil and gas fields are considered to have some of the largest reserves in the world. It is interesting to note that after the Taliban turned down Unocal, A. President Bush signed a presidential directive prior to 9/11 to organize the attack of Afghanistan. B. The new president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, is a former employee of Unocal. C. The first piece of new business for the leaders of the Northern Alliance was an agreement for Unocal and Halliburton to build the pipeline. Point 49. Our Air Force sent out thousands of planes to shoot high-tech missiles into Afghanistan's few existing office buildings, warehouses, stores, schools, hospitals, and homes. We sent thousands of troops over and invaded their country, destroyed their ragtag military forces, and overthrew their government. This is what I call an act of war. Maybe you would too. There was a vote by Congress to allow the president to proceed, yet Congress never declared war, as is prescribed very articulately in our Constitution. Either we follow the rules of the Constitution, or we don't have one. Point 50. Oh, by the way, not one of the hijackers was from Afghanistan. Bin Laden said that he didn't do it. And the Taliban said that they would hand bin Laden over if the U.S. would give them any proof that he was involved. Just for the record. Point 51. American Special Forces directed and supported the Northern Alliance in defeating the Taliban forces. It was really not much of a battle. It was the Americans with 21st century Star Wars weapons versus a bunch of goat herders with 19th and 20th century rifles. One of the American military's favorite tactics in this duck shoot was to drop incendiary bombs from planes that would fly in at altitudes far higher than the range of the pathetic pop-gun artillery pieces the Taliban possessed. These bombs would spray a petroleum substance over an area about the size of a football field. As this substance was floating down to the ground, it would be ignited, creating both an unusually severe thermal combustion and also it would suck all of the air out of the area. No living being could escape this holocaust. After one of these confrontations in northern Afghanistan, approximately 2,000 dazed Taliban were taken prisoner. The Northern Alliance victors crammed the prisoners into railroad boxcars, which were left to bake in the hot sun, and gave them no food or water. After several days, those who were still alive, many of them mere boys, were taken out of the cars, shot in the head, and buried in shallow graves. Can't you feel the love? Point 52. Speak about feeling the love. On 9/11, 2,998 people were killed in New York, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon. It was called
the worst terrorist act in history.
The pain and suffering to the related families and to the people around the world in general cannot be described. Many people say and believe that our nation is a cut above the rest because many profess to believe in the teachings of Jesus. Yet according to Professor Mark Harold of the University of New Hampshire, between October the 7th and December the 7th of 2001, our special forces killed a minimum of 3,800 innocent Afghan tribal people, mostly old men, women, and children. Professor Harold says that number is only what was reported by the major media. The real numbers of slaughtered non-combatants was probably closer to 5,000. And papers in India reported that there were more than 20,000 killed. All of this was done in the name of the people of the United States, under the euphemism,
Operation Infinite Justice.
There has been very little response or even discussion by the clergy, media, or population in general about this massacre.
I wonder, what would Jesus say about Operation Infinite Justice?
Point 53. The following could be considered funny if it were not so distressing. On the morning of 9/11, President Bush was at the Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. Before going into the classroom for a photo op, he was told by White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card that Flight 11 had just crashed into the North Tower. Undeterred and with a stiff upper lip, Bush proceeded with his schedule and went into the classroom for photos with the kids who were going to read him a story about a pet goat. During the pet goat story, Andrew Card came in and told the president that a second airliner had just slammed into the World Trade Center South Tower.
Bush then responded with the clear thinking and determination of a true leader. He stayed in the classroom listening to the pet goat story for another 26 minutes. After leaving the classroom, it took him another 29 minutes before he put the military on high alert, and it was during this period of time that the Pentagon was hit. From there, instead of returning to Washington as Commander-in-Chief, to huddle with his military advisors and to reassure the American people, he flew over to Louisiana and then up to the Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. He did not arrive back in Washington until 7 p.m., 10 hours after he had been told about the second flight that crashed into the World Trade Center. That pet goat story must have been mesmerizing. Point 54. When I originally got into politics, one of the first axioms I learned when trying to figure out what was going on was, follow the money. It must be pointed out
that the Bush family is deeply involved with the Carlyle Group, one of the nation's largest defense contractors. The Carlyle Group is a multinational octopus that is generating megabucks from the war on terrorism. Another one of the knights in shining armor that is profiting big time from the Carlyle Group and this hysteria is Khalid bin Mahfouz, brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden. Brother Cheney, as already mentioned, has his fingers deep in the pie. When you look at the list of personalities that are supposedly serving our nation in positions of leadership that appear to be making a killing out of the killing, it really is quite sad. Point 55. The World Trade Center land lease was sold to a Mr. Silverstein for $100 million down, just a short time previous to the attack. He put a very large insurance premium on the complex, even though the buildings were experiencing higher than normal vacancies and had significant asbestos problems. This son of a gun is now trying to get double the amount on his original insurance coverage, $7.1 billion. Not a bad return. And again, speaking about following the money, it was said several times in the first weeks after 9/11 that there were large, and I mean large, international deposits of gold bullion that were deposited in the huge vault in the basement. Gold is a very heavy element, and though it could melt, it would not be pulverized. It has also been said that there were large digital deposits credited to the bank within the World Trade Center. Where, oh where did this money go? Nobody but nobody seems to be talking. Can you say,
bank robbery?
Point 56. George Orwell, in his classic book 1984, created a story that seems so far out just years ago. Today, Orwell's description of a society gone mad with doublespeak and tyranny does not seem so foreign. The Patriot Act is thousands of pages. I wonder if this could have been prepared before 9/11? And strips our Constitution down to its shell. It allows the police to enter your home, take your possessions, and to arrest you without a warrant. Further, it allows trials without juries. The administration says that this is only for terrorists. However, the definition of what a terrorist is undefined and at the discretion of the administration. The Office of Homeland Security is right out of Adolf Hitler's manual, and its enthusiastic leader, Mr. Tom Ridge, seems intent on exercising his almost unlimited power. Whole books can be and are being written on this unconstitutional, blatant, and immoral grab for power. These two quotes by our president are very indicative of what is happening.
If this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier, just so long as I'm the dictator.
George Bush, December the 18th, 2001, on CNN.
This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including email, the internet, and all cell phones.
President George W. Bush. Point 57. Since 9/11, appropriations for military spending is up more than $60 billion, and appropriations for the alphabet agencies is up a minimum of $6 billion, probably much more. During this same period of time, the deficit on our trade balance has increased by more than $40 billion, and the so-called surplus they said we had on our annual operating budget has again turned into a major, big-time deficit. Somebody, well, that means you and me, is going to have to pay for this with more taxes or more inflation. This is a simple fact that the CFR boys don't talk much about. Maybe it's because they own the banks that are making the profits from these loans. Point 58. Osama bin Laden. Remember that turban fellow? For 6 months, you could see his face full time on almost every channel, and then we invaded Afghanistan, and Mr. bin Laden suddenly disappeared. In November of 2001 through January of 2002, MSNBC, The New Yorker, and The Times all ran articles that said Pakistan's secret police, the ISI, which are directly controlled by the CIA, airlifted several thousand members of Al-Qaeda and perhaps Osama out of Afghanistan to safety. If this is true, it is one more major act of treason. It is worthy to look at the similarities of 9/11 and what happened during the Gulf War in 1991. For almost a year in 1991, we heard nothing except how despotic Saddam Hussein was. Our nation then spent close to $100 billion, invaded Iraq, smashed his army, destroyed the infrastructure of that nation, and killed over 100,000 Iraqis. Bush Sr. then told our military to leave Saddam alone. What is this? What the power elite did not tell you is that Saddam Hussein, like Osama bin Laden, was a CIA asset, and that they needed him as a Trojan horse. Mark my words, if Osama is still alive, he will be back in the news in the not-too-distant future, when they need him. Point 59. Speaking of Iraq, Bush, Cheney, and the rest of the military-industrial establishment have been using every tactic they can to gain support for an attack on Iraq. Their story is that Saddam has built up a huge arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, together with creating a secret long-range missile program. The problem with this story is that in 1991 we blew away their military, destroyed their infrastructure, and since that period of time we have had an embargo and inspectors in their country. An appalling sidebar to this story is, according to the United Nations, over 500,000 Iraqi children have died of starvation and lack of medical supplies since the embargo has been in effect. To be conservative, let's say that the true numbers were wildly inflated by 500%. That still means that over 100,000 children have died. Yes, Saddam is a tyrant, just like all the leaders of nations in the Middle East are. And I'm not wild about Iraq, but I do know they love their children and families just as we do. Saddam has said over and over that their country is open to inspection, and according to the top UN inspector, Scott Ritter, an American Marine, and a Bush Republican to boot, Iraq has none of these weapons. I repeat, he says Iraq has none of these weapons. Point 60. Oh, a lot of this information is really sad and depressing, so on this last point, we'll give you something that should make you smile, a wry smile. A, the FBI has said that they had no prior information, but within days of the attack, they had the names and pictures of 19 hijackers. Sherlock Holmes on steroids couldn't have come close to this feat. Oh, by the way, again, several of the names on that list have shown up alive in Morocco, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. B, the FBI said they found Mohammed Atta's bag, which supposedly did not make it on the plane. What incredibly good fortune for the perpetrators. Investigators. In this travel bag was all sorts of information. The only question is, why would a hijacker who is intent on committing suicide pack a travel bag and load it full of incriminating evidence? C, last but not least, days after 9/11, the New York police chief says they found the passport of one of the hijackers. Amazing! They would have us believe that a paper passport jumped out of his coat, morphed through the plane, passed through the fireball, and wafted gently down to the city streets to be discovered unharmed. Who writes this stuff? Looking at the big picture.
The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists.
J. Edgar Hoover. In bullet summary, we know 1. The CIA helped create Al-Qaeda and that bin Laden was a CIA asset. 2. The Bush and bin Laden families have been longtime friends and business partners. We also know sources high in the government have interfered with the investigation of Osama. 3. Even though there is overwhelming objective information that demonstrates that there were numerous people, agencies, and governments that had awareness of the diabolical plot previous to 9/11, our FBI and CIA stoutly maintain they had no prior knowledge. 4. The information as presented to the American public about the hijackers and what happened with Flights 11, 175, 93, and 77 is full of gaping holes and misinformation. 5. The jetliners did not bring down World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2. Further, the media and government have promoted the pancake theory as the cause of the collapse. Objective review of the evidence shows that this theory does not hold water. 6. It is apparent explosives were in place prior to the planes hitting the buildings, and that these explosives were used in the demolition of World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7. Further, there was also a bomb or bombs in World Trade Center building 6. 7. Flight 93 was shot down over Pennsylvania. 8. There was either massive criminal negligence on the parts of the FAA and NORAD, or, at some level of command, the orders were given to step down and not scramble fighters to protect New York City or the Capitol. 9. The government is withholding vital information concerning Flight 77 and what actually happened at the Pentagon. 10. The administration has quashed all efforts to have an honest congressional investigation of the worst terrorist act in our nation's history. 11. Between paper passports passing unharmed through fireballs, hijackers leaving a Koran in a strip bar, and a suicide bomber packing a travel bag that contains complete details of the crime, which conveniently does not make the flight, there appears to be a significant amount of manufactured evidence. 12. These events deserve further investigation. American Airlines Flight 587 mysteriously went down over New York City with no investigation. Super high-tech anthrax was used as a terrorist weapon. A disco in Bali was blown up using high-tech explosives. A sniper killed several people indiscriminately in Washington. And Senator Paul Wellstone, who had been asking the wrong questions, dies in a fiery airplane accident. 13. Bush, Cheney, and many others who daily have been advocating intense military action in the Middle East are directly invested in companies that make huge profits from warfare. 14. The results of the Afghanistan War. Constitutional law was abandoned. Thousands of innocent tribal peoples were killed. A puppet government was installed and is headed by a UNICAL employee. The pipeline for UNICAL and Halliburton was okayed. The World Bank and the IMF now control the Afghanistan economy. And opium production has increased by over 900%. The result is the Illuminati have gained control of another country, and the quality of life for the peoples of Afghanistan has been ratcheted to a new low. 15. With the creation of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act, what doublespeak, our Constitution has been raped, and we are now de facto in a police state. 16. The corporate media, television, radio, magazines, and newspapers parrot the party line like clones. In a truly free country, the press has to ask the hard questions and do real investigating. This is not happening. Even more distressing, a vast majority of Americans have accepted this story, hook, line, and sinker. Why would they do this? So, we have all of this information, but the obvious question is why? Why would they do this? When Rome was still a functioning republic, Roman judges would always ask the question,
Qui bono?
Or, who benefited from this crime? When we ask ourselves this simple question, we see A. The arms dealers are selling hundreds of billions of dollars in new weaponry. B. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank have created over $1 trillion in new loans in the last year alone. C. Ariel Sharon and his group of hardliner political Zionists are jumping for joy because they have been pushing the United States for years to aggressively attack Arab nations. This is a very sensitive issue because there are distinct, opposing, and emotional points of view concerning the Middle East, regardless of which side of the fence you stand on concerning Israel and the Arabs. When Ariel Sharon recently said,
I don't care what the American people think. I own the Congress.
It should create significant concern for all Americans, especially because he is probably correct. D. The multinational oil corporations have taken control of the rich Caspian oil fields and now have their eyes set on Iraq. E. The Illuminati has always known that the freedom-loving, God-conscious people of the United States were always going to be their biggest problem. With 9/11, many of our brothers and sisters have become so afraid and so confused that they are willing to turn over their rights for promised security. I realize the immensity of this information, this conspiracy, is hard to accept. Our minds tell us that we are in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, and this is not the way it is supposed to be. Well, as Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz,
Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore.
Take a deep breath and please listen to these following quotes.
Today, America would be outraged if UN troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow, they will be grateful. This is especially true if they were told that there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all people of the world will plead to deliver them from this evil. The one thing every man fears is the unknown. When presented with this scenario, individual rights will be willingly relinquished for the guarantee of their well-being, granted to them by the world government.
Henry Kissinger, Bilderberg Conference, 1991, in Evian, France.
We can't be so fixated on our desire to preserve the rights of ordinary Americans.
President Bill Clinton in USA Today on March the 11th, 1993, page 2A. The interest behind the Bush administration, such as the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, founded by Brzezinski for David Rockefeller, and the Bilderberg Group, have prepared for and are now moving to implement open world dictatorship, within the next 5 years. Dr. Johannes Koppel, former official of the German Ministry for Defense and advisor to NATO.
We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order.
David Rockefeller. Is resistance futile? Well, isn't this lovely? All of the major movers and shakers and warlords are telling us to our faces to pack it in because the game is essentially over. It reminds me of the television series Star Trek, when the Enterprise, the good guys, come up against the Borg, the bad guys, who are half human and half machine. The Borg repeat only one message.
Resistance is futile.
We really do have some significant choices in front of us. If one is relatively new to this point of view, it can be, and probably is, very overwhelming. Most people in our nation have been so well conditioned, and their minds are so compartmentalized that they cannot even contemplate this information. However, since you are listening to this booklet now, you would not have gotten to this point without having at least a relatively open mind. The first question must be,
is this information true?
My response? Each person who reads this booklet and other information concerning 911 needs a very discerning mind. Please, please, please check and double-check all the references. This stuff is kind of serious, to put it gently. Perhaps most importantly, listen to your subconscious. Does your inner voice say that this information is correct? This is a very individual choice. The second question is the big one.
What can we do? Or is resistance futile?
Here is where we really separate the wheat from the chaff. Clearly, these rascals control the banks, the media, the government, most of the technology, and the minds of most people. It doesn't sound fair, does it? This is where faith and prayer have to become the guiding light. Do we really believe in the Creator? Do we really believe that the Creator wants our families, our culture, and our world dominated by literally a handful of materialistic, egotistical, secular atheists who view 99% of the human race as cattle, or at best, no more than servants? I know that these are hard concepts to let one's mind contemplate, but we really don't have the luxury of time. Be aware, ignorance and denial are death sentences. We really are in a cycle that is comparable to Nazi Germany. Though there are places you can run to, and perhaps immigrate to, they really won't be safe for very long. If you know in your heart that there is a creative force, God, you know that this march towards a tyrannical new world order is not something that God wants. This nightmare is the creation of human beings who have forgotten their connection with Spirit and have and are making some very bad choices. It is up to us as individuals to examine ourselves and decide whether we are going to focus our life energies on love, truth, and justice, and stand for these ideals, or whether we are going to give away our own spiritual sovereignty to the masters of deception. The 7-point program. If we truly believe in God, and if we truly want to experience our highest spiritual awareness, then we have some significant work in front of us. Because such an amazing percentage of good people are putting their heads in the sand when it comes to 911, it means that we have that much more work to do. But remember, at the start of the American Revolution, only 5% of the colonists were really leading the way. The restoration of our republic and revitalization of any semblance of truth, peace, and justice for our civilization is spiritual work. And as Thomas Jefferson said,
resistance to tyrants is obedience to God.
The following is a 7-step program for every citizen. First and foremost, close your eyes and go deep within your soul and humbly and passionately connect with your divine self, the creative force of the universe. Ask for clarity, guidance, and strength. Remember, the power of prayer is much more powerful than the power of hate. If ever there was a time to put aside our egos and ask for help, now is that time. Awareness of the game is the second step. The Illuminati, in their own twisted and sad minds, have created this extraordinary illusion to create as much fear as possible, and they have done an extraordinarily good job. We also need to understand that 911 is not the apex of this perverted drama. It is only the opening salvo of the power elite's in-game strategy. Most certainly there will be further Hegelian events, problem, reaction, and solution, that will be manufactured and coming our way. The third step in this dance is gather as much objective information as possible. As Francis Bacon said,
knowledge is power.
The source and reference material in this audio is just awesome. Fourth, we positively, absolutely, no questions asked, have to share this information with friends, family, acquaintances, strangers, everyone. Don't be shy. Sharing this information with others is a great way to start because it is short and hopefully understandable and of interest. Many of the people that you share this information with won't get it, but believe me, every day there are more and more people who are waking up to the lies and manipulation. Creating a website, starting a study group, or even getting a public access television show is something each person is capable of doing. Yes, these actions do take time and energy, but you know what? The rewards of reaching out and sharing this essential information with others is extremely rewarding on a personal level. Step 5. Stop playing their game. Self-sufficiency is the key word. Put a ceiling on desires and do not live on credit. Know that the number one weapon that the elite use to enslave us emotionally, mentally, and physically is through the manipulation of the fractional reserve banking systems. Further, know that bullies, tyrants, and dictators always want to be the center of attention. And in today's world, our society is caught up in glorifying the power elite. Our media is totally fixated on the politicians, movie stars, famous athletes, and the mega rich. Turn off the TV. It really is a mind sucker. And stop supporting the Church of Hollywood. Know it is time for the sovereign peoples of this nation to start creating our own communication systems, schools, businesses, and economies that are based on sustainability, value, and higher human values. We need to focus our attentions on the real and good things of life and the obvious, like buying American-made products. Number 6 is the hard one. Love all and serve all. This is the external spiritual step. Letting go of fear and manifesting love for ourselves, friends, family, and even those rascals who are part of the power elite. This is something I'm still working on. And helping those who are less fortunate than ourselves. This also includes staying in the moment, giving our very finest attention and energies to this situation, and detaching from the results. by staying centered and having faith in the Creator, we will be able to speak the truth and do our work with courage, power, and wisdom. Oh, the seventh point. To some, it may seem less important, but to me, it is a big one. Get outside, breathe deeply, hang out with your friends, play with your family, have fun, and remember to laugh, for a life without joy is just not living. Okay, so that's the story. It comes down to a personal choice for each person. We can live in fear and ignorance and watch as victims as our nation, community, and families are threatened by the rising tide of tyranny. Or we can stay in the moment, open and follow our hearts to God's love, claim our divine sovereignty, and do the right thing. Remember, it's up to us.
Hi, this is George Humphrey. At the present time, the United States military is in Iraq, and to date, close to 1,000 American boys and girls have been killed. Over 9,000 have been sent home wounded, and we've spent over $250 billion. Using conservative numbers, over 15,000 Iraqis have been killed. We have turned their society into shambles, and central Iraq has been turned into an ecological wasteland because of the use of depleted uranium. And, by the way, there were no weapons of mass destruction. Quite clearly, we all have a choice. Is the truth important? Do we want to live in a constitutional republic where individual rights are honored, or do we want to continue to hand over our nation to the self-professed power elite and continue this march toward a complete police state? Most importantly, do we believe in the Creator and the universal laws of truth, peace, justice, and love? I hope that you found this documentary of interest and value, and I hope that you will check out the reference. Thanks for your interest.